All poets are liars, but not in the way you think. Let me explain. Every week, I receive hundreds of messages telling me how I've interpreted a verse wrongly, and the justification is that you've interpreted it wrongly because this is not what Ghalib meant, or this is not what Mir meant, or this is not what John Elia meant, and so on. And it makes me very curious to understand or try to figure out why people think that the poet can be trusted as a reliable source. Now, obviously, if you can't trust the poet, then who can you trust? Well, let me give you a hint. You can definitely trust your own self. What am I talking about? In his book, Ghalib, Shamsur Faruqi, one of the most famous Urdu critics of all time, writes this, and I'm going to translate it in English as well. बाज़ लोगों का ख्याल है कि शेर के वही मानी बयान करना चाहिए जो शायर के इंदिए में हो। ये फ़लसफ़ा शरा यानी hermeneutics का बहुत बड़ा मसला है। आजकल मगरिब में इस पर बहुत बहस हो रही है और इस पर हरफ़ आखिर शायद कभी ना कहा जा सके। मैं यही कह सकता हूँ कि मशरक़ी शरियात में शायर के इंदिए को कोई ख़ास अहमियत हासिल नहीं, और मगरिबी मुफ़क्किरों का भी एक बड़ा ग्रोह इस बात का कायल है कि हर वो मानी जो शेर के अल्फाज से बरामद हो सकें वो सही है। मैं ख़ुद इस बात का कायल हूँ कि शेर का हम पर यह हक़ है कि हम उसकी बारीक तरीन मानी तलाश करें और जितने कसीर मानी शेर में मुमकिन हों उनको दरियाफ़्त करें। In short, what he is saying is that a lot of people think that what the poet believes or what the poet meant or what the poet's life was should affect how we interpret a poem. However, Shamsur Faruqi argues against that, and he says that there is no one right way of interpreting a poem. Even if you think that the poet meant something, it is our right to believe that there are multiple more meanings that can come out of it, some that maybe even the poet has not considered. This idea can be very nicely evidenced by this sher of Ghalib. Ghalib writes, Ghalib khasta ke baghair kaun se kaam band hain, roye zar zar kya, kije hai hai kyun. In essence, to translate this, he says, in poor Ghalib's absence, what tasks are stopped today? Then why shed such copious tears? Why lament in vain? Which means that Ghalib is saying that I am a mere humble human being who has nothing to do with anything, and even if I die, the world will not stop and it will continue going. Ghalib khasta, Ghalib the feeble, has no say in this universe. Then why should we cry and why should we lament death? Now, anyone who knows Ghalib knows that he was too proud to just humble himself like that. And if we went on that, if we just considered Ghalib's life as our metric, then this sher would be a contradiction. Because in this sher, clearly Ghalib is trying to say that there is nothing that will stop the world even if I die. However, Ghalib the person would argue that he is the greatest poet of all time, and when we know that through people who've written about him, he knew how good he was. So what is really happening? Let me introduce to you the concept of what we call in fiction a narrator. In fiction, in prose, it's very easy for us to believe that what is being written is not being written by the author, but is actually being written by a narrator, which means that if XYZ happens in a book, that doesn't mean that the author is doing it, that just means that the narrator is doing it, or the narrator is merely telling you the story. In a similar way, we forget that poetry also has narrators. So if a poet writes something about himself, that doesn't mean it's true. If anything, it could mean that a narrator is saying all of that. Somehow we apply the same rules to fiction, but we don't apply the same rules to poetry. And this is a major misconception. Shamsur Faruqi straight up goes to say that you don't need to believe the meaning or the opinion of the poet. You can disagree with the one who writes the poem, because once the poem has been written or once the couplet has been written, it is not in your control. And the interpretation and the right to interpretation does not only belong to the poet, it belongs to anyone who can interpret it. Now, before I end this video, there is an important disclaimer. He also writes that we should try to find meanings within it as much as possible, which implies that we shouldn't try to make conjectures that we cannot prove through the couplet. So that doesn't mean that we get a free pass of interpreting a couplet just as we like. We need to evidence it through the poem itself or through the couplet itself. However, that interpretation can very well disagree with the interpretation of the poet himself. The beauty of poetry is that it doesn't belong to anyone, even not the person who writes it.